America, and today we are speaking with James Phillip, author of Two Revolutions and the Constitution. James Phillip is a Sydney-based lawyer who is, interested in the American Constitution. So this is a very interesting perspective coming from somebody from Australia. So I'm really excited to talk to you, James. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeanette.
Of course. So talk to me a little bit about your book and why it matters today, especially in our current climate, as the world can see how America is dealing with some tumultuous times.
Well, the book doesn't present solutions for the moment, but what it does seek to do is to help readers to better understand where the Constitution came from. And I think this is so important, working for a long time as a lawyer, but also having a deep interest in history and just watching the affairs of the world from day to day in a political context, in a business context. I think what you often see is people who don't have enough depth of understanding of what they're doing, the context of the environment which they're operating in. This is really important. It used to happen as a lawyer sometimes. You'd have these terrible moments where your client had briefed you on everything that was possibly relevant to the transaction. I was a transactional lawyer mostly. And then you'd find the people across the other side of the table, the lawyers on the other side, knew more than you about the deep context and what the real motivations of the parties and the context in which they were operating were, and you could never perform as well. So for quite a long time, I've had a bit of an obsession with deep context. And what I sought to do with the book was to say, well, a lot of books obviously have been written about particularly the American Revolution, but then also about the Constitution and its origins. Most of them begin with the revolutionary period. But we know why the revolution happened in the sense of the British sort of tightening control on the substantially independent American colonies and all that stuff. But what was the sort of society and worldview of the revolutionary generation, and how had that come about? I don't think you can answer that question just by looking at the revolutionary period. I do think you can answer it if you do what I've done in this book, which is to go right back to the founding of the first colonies and to consider not only the major developments in America that influenced the Americans from the founding of the first colonies, but also what was happening in Britain at that time, because don't forget, Americans were living under a variant of the English and then the British Constitution, right? Mm-hmm. So understanding what was driving the English and the British is vitally important. And of course, it turns out that the 1600s were a revolutionary period in England. I think it's a bit like this in America too, but in Australia, I learned at school about the French Revolution, but not about the English Revolution. But as Professor Pincus of Chicago University has pointed out in a relatively recent book, there's a very strong case to be made for the fact that the English Revolution was far more consequential. It was also 100 years earlier.
So, but why? How is the English Revolution important today, especially with the turmoils American citizens are currently facing? How is that history going to, and I know you're saying this is not a solution-based, and this is primarily a historical snapshot, but you also talk about how our Constitution is really a pivot point in the story of our humanity. And so when you look at across our country and you can point to this important document that has helped shape not just our country, but other countries around the world, and then you look at the realities on the ground here, how can we still look at this document in the way that you have in this book?
Well, one of the things that's important is that the English Revolution and the experience of Americans, of the American Revolutionary generation, was very much about resisting tyranny.
Mhm.
Now, that was to a significant degree a political, that thought, that motivation gathered momentum very much from the English period. I mean, the English in 1649 put their king on trial, found him guilty of tyranny, and cut off his head. Now, when Thomas Jefferson was drafting the Declaration of Independence, he either had a copy of the charges against Charles I, or he was so imbued with the philosophy that had started at that time that the Declaration of Independence follows quite closely the charges against Charles I. So the founders were very conscious that they were effectively, from an American point of view, chopping off the head, trying and chopping off the head of George III. They followed almost exactly the same charges and the same language. 1649 in England was the first charge of tyranny against a ruler. There are leading human rights lawyers, one of who's been kind enough to write a blurb for my book, who argue that actually that was the beginning of crimes against humanity. So by the time of the American Revolutionary period, you've got this not just a strong belief that American liberties are being infringed, but you have a tradition by then of over 100 years of the English holding their kings to account. In the first case, the first part of the English Revolution, cutting off the head of the king, and in the second case, basically causing him to leave the country and renovate the Constitution. So one of the very strong themes you have in the Constitution is a determination to make sure the executive, the president, can't become a tyrant. But that gets infused as a result of the period leading up to the revolution itself, with a desire to not make the legislature, Congress, a tyrant. So one of the main features of the American Constitution, as you know, is basically embedded friction between the president and Congress. Right. Now, as we saw very clearly, I think, during the Trump presidency, that means that a president can play directly to their electoral base, and perhaps not just not work in a cooperative manner with Congress, but even use differences with Congress, use that friction to help invigorate their own electoral base. So this is checks and balances and counterpower and deliberate friction built into the model can also lead to, let's say, confrontation and in some circumstances, dysfunction. So that, let's say, doesn't help. And yet that's a consequence of the famed checks and balances of the Constitution. Of course, America's contemporary issues go beyond the political and constitutional field into deep cultural issues. But just talking about the way the Constitution operates, that's the way I'd frame it.
I see. It's such an interesting place and a perspective to rectify and come to terms with when you talk about, you give credit to the first settlers for wanting to get away from tyranny and trying to establish this sort of utopian society. However, the history of America is very clear, and so it is disingenuous to not include the tyranny that came with the founding of America, regardless of where it comes from. So how do you rectify the totality of the history of America and its founding, regardless of the influence of the Magna Carta? How do you rectify this storytelling when it comes to the founding of America? And I know that your book is a positive review of the Constitution. But I do find that there's a lot of missing pieces, and that has to do with the cultural aspect that you just mentioned, the humanitarian aspect that you gave credit to. You said, the British people were some of the first to actually make laws against human rights. And as a matter of fact, some of the language of the Magna Carta is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But how do you rectify that with the total story of not just America, but even Great Britain?
Well, that's the big question. You're right. I focus in the book mainly on the progression from, if you like, a medieval conception of monarchy to the time of the revolution, where you're talking about a representative republic, but not a universally representative republic. And I assume, there are a number of people who are, of course, excluded from the franchise and excluded from political power at the time of the revolution. Most dramatically, of course, they include slaves. They also include Native Americans. They also include substantially women, but they also include, white men without property. Well, it's a big story to explain how that came about, but in a sense, it's not a difficult story. Don't forget, one of the things I would say is we mustn't forget how desperately poor almost everyone was at this time in human history, right? You look at a measure like GDP per capita, and until 1800, almost everyone is desperately poor. There are some exceptions, and there are a number of exceptions in the room in Philadelphia where the Constitution was drafted, of course. But grinding poverty, low life expectancy, people were economically desperate. So if you look at something like, this is not the subject of the book, but if you were to look at something like why were slaves introduced to Virginia in 1619, part of the answer would be that the colony was failing. It was desperately poor. The settlers had been dying, etc. They look across to the Caribbean. They see people making a lot of money and thriving on the back of a terribly brutal version of slavery. As you know, slavery had been widespread around the world, but there was a particularly brutal form of it that had been developed in the Caribbean. That's not the American pronunciation, excuse me, but and it was imported to Virginia in 1619. So that's its own story and its own tragedy. But you also see, of course, Native Americans, the population's devastated initially by disease, but then some negotiations, but let's say generally exclusion, dispossession. You see a lot of political prisoners and others not much talked about in America. One of the catalysts for the founding of the British colony in Australia was actually the American Revolution, because English convicts, British convicts were sent to America as indentured servants and other things. These people had no political rights. So overall, massive poverty is one of the causes. People are just desperate to get by. So property has disproportionate power, if you like, compared with now. Another major theme is the one I alluded to, that not a theme of the book, but in answering a question, is the journey from basically medieval feudal concepts of government, that you have a few strong men at the top who have a military function and who also own directly or indirectly most of the agricultural land at a time when agriculture is the main asset class. So they're the ones with political power, they're the ones with economic power. So to me, the mystery isn't so much how did all that happen, because that's sort of deep history, and it did happen and it was the norm for a long time. The really interesting thing is the journey from that to towards where we are now. And what my book is about, of course, is the journey in the American colonies from their founding in the early 1600s to the time of the Constitution. So that's why, if you say the book has a generally positive view, that would be why, because if you see it in the bigger context, let me put it this way, ask another question. Don't think of it in terms of the negatives for the moment, the people who didn't get political power through the American Constitution in the short term, although they did in the long term. Think about where that much political power could have been that widely dispersed anywhere else in the world. I don't think there is anywhere else.
If you go to ancient African history, you do see documented history of this power and of these societies that were constructed. As a matter of fact, even philosophers like Plato point to Africa as their basis of the knowledge that they've gained. And so a lot of the knowledge that does come out of Great Britain, it is certainly influenced by Africa and other Middle Eastern countries and Arabs and Spain and so forth. So is there room for that? Is there room to include the influence of even the Magna Carta as we talk about the importance of the Constitution and its lineage?
This is a question.
I know you.
Well, exactly. This is an important question. I mean, you certainly wouldn't say that. Let me go back. A very important influence on English liberties and therefore on American liberties was actually the emergence of the Dutch Republic. Where did the Dutch get their republican and relatively pluralistic, non-monarchical system of government from? They got it partly from the exigencies of trying to resist the Spanish Empire, when the only land you occupy is some sort of boggy land on the edge of the North Sea, and the desperate need to have a cooperative system of government. Where do they look to? They look back, as did the English to some extent, but the Americans in particular. They certainly look back to the classical Greek and Roman time. As far as I'm aware, African influence was not direct or overt, or it may have been, although it may have been indirect. So of course, these things, people draw from all over the place when they're putting these things together, but the dominant themes were the framework, in the American case, were the framework of the English and then the British Constitution, their revolutions, the American charters, infused, and this is a topic I don't go into in any detail in the book, with quite a lot of learning about the Mediterranean world's classical period and its political philosophy. But as you say, you could talk about the infusion of Christian morality and concepts into this whole process. And of course, if you're talking about that, then you're going back to Judaic, and then if you're talking about that, you're going back, further. So I agree, and in a sense, if what you're saying is that the origins of some of these things are complex and they go back a long way and to different places, absolutely. And in a way, that's what I was trying to do in the book. Whilst I wanted the book to be fairly short, I wanted it to be not more than 200 pages because I wanted it to be something that was readable to people who don't always read these sort of books. So of course, I haven't explored all these issues in depth. But what I definitely have done is to say, look, this didn't fall out of the sky at the Philadelphia Convention. It wasn't created in a vacuum by some sort of divine act or human genius. It was, and I'm not denigrating the innovations and the intelligence, etc., of the people who were in the room in Philadelphia drafting this in 1787, but I'm just saying they were operating within a context, and what I've tried to draw out are the main aspects of that context in through the British-American world. But there are external influences on the development of that world as well, definitely.
What are your thoughts on the future of this country and the future of the Constitution, or the ability and the power of the Constitution to hold this country together from an Australian perspective?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that the country will stay together. To me, the concern is, or the issue is, does this propensity of the Constitution to generate friction between different arms of government, does that tend to facilitate the cultural friction and differences in America rather than help to provide a solution to their resolution? Because to me, I would guess that the key to it's very important for America in the medium term. It'd be nice if it could happen in the short term, that there is some sort of enlivening of the middle ground. And I mean, you know, left liberals and moderate conservatives. What's so alarming to me about America's current situation is you have extreme progressives, and then I don't know what you say, nativist. They're not really, I don't perceive them as conservatives. Let's call them sort of nativist Americans at the other extreme, both making so much of the noise. And all the non-crazy people in the middle seem to be somewhat disempowered. So to me, the big question for America and the Constitution, America's political system and the Constitution, is how can you reinvigorate the center, both the center right and the center left? Because unless you can do that, you're just going to continue to have this shrill, rather dysfunctional conflict.
What about the Trump effect? Has Trump's legacy and the way he ran his administration, and even to what he's currently doing, how has that impacted our Constitution? And do you think that his presidency has exposed a weakness in our Constitution and in our concept, in our perception as Americans when it comes to our rights and how we view politics?
Well, that's another big question. I'll say this, that one of the reasons for the Electoral College and in the debates at the Constitutional Convention about the presidency was the concern that because of the way communications were in those days, it would be unlikely that presidential candidates would be well known outside their home state, right? And so the idea that you'd have this sort of celebrity president who would use the tools that are available now to build a sort of a national fan base, particularly over a country that's, you know, in terms of its population, more than 100 times bigger, and in terms of its geographic and cultural diversity, much more diverse, although the first 13 colonies were already quite diverse in their views of the world and the nature of their economies and other things. That would have been inconceivable to the founders. So the possibility that a political party could be sort of largely taken over or dominated by someone who hadn't worked their way up through the party and didn't always seem to display much regard for the party, but just expected the party to fall in line with his, you know, celebrity taunts and all the rest. That would have been, I think, just completely inconceivable and not what would have been expected at all. I mean, influenced partly by the classical conceptions, very much personified in the person of George Washington. What the founders and the framers were hoping for was a citizen who was preeminent in their virtue as the president. And that's probably not a description that you'd associate with President Trump. Although the meaning of the word virtue has changed. In those days, it really meant an exemplar of the classical ideas of stoicism, serving the public interest, self-sacrifice for the public good. That was their conception of the president. So we've clearly come a long way from that. And how have we got there? Well, we've got there, the process has been accelerating as these tools of mass communication have been improving. And now, as you know, that people can reach such targeted audiences in cunning ways with different messages for different subgroups of the audience. So this is completely unforeseen, definitely by the framers. But even if you went back 50 years, this would have been perhaps a surprise to anyone that the presidency could be won in that manner and then conducted in that manner.
And still have a lasting effect, as you know. Even after the former president lost the election, he was able to organize his supporters to, conduct a wannabe coup or charge the Capitol, the January 6th incident.
Well, he was able to disorganize them to do that, might be a better way of putting it. I mean, it was a complete shambles, but it was obviously
people died. People died.
I know. It was obviously a terrible event, and terrible that he incited it. And you wonder about the people who participated, because they presumably thought they were operating as part of a bigger plan because of all the strange things Trump had been saying for months before. But of course, there was no bigger plan, and they just ended up looking like like idiots, and it ended up as a more of a riot than a coup, but obviously an appalling incident. But I think something like 800 people were involved in actually entered the Capitol. Those 800 people would have a very unusual psychological profile, I'm guessing. So in a way, whilst it was a horrible incident, and obviously an important part of the picture, the bigger question for me is not why such a tiny group of fringe people would behave oddly to the sort of suggestions coming from Trump, which didn't in fact seem to be part of any plan. They just seemed to be someone who couldn't cope with, who was having his own issues with losing.
Right.
The surprise isn't so much that 800 people end up doing that, or shocking as it was. The interesting issue for me is why so many moderate Republicans have been prepared to go along with the show and not say that, even though I think that some of the stuff happening on the left of the Democratic Party is very bad for the country and it's horrific, and I'm very animated and upset about that, that they still don't regard it as a screening item, if you like, the character of the candidate. Because I would have thought you could be, and I'm sure there are many people in this category who are strongly opposed to the capture of the Democratic Party by this sort of new form of sort of ideological progressive, but who would not choose as their agent in the fight someone of his character, and that so many people have. That's the surprising thing to me. I don't know what that tells us.
And this leads to, when you talk about the checks and balances within the Constitution, and although a lot of efforts were made to to really circumvent the checks and balances that have been put in place. You could see how it all played out when, the Washington, D.C., the mayor couldn't get, the troops to come and protect folks here, or have proper barricades up. They knew these protesters were planning to riot, storm the Capitol, whatever they were planning on doing. This has been in the works for a long time. But yet the checks and balances that you highlight in your book, in the Constitution, nearly caused members of Congress to lose their lives during while they're at work. People, American citizens, angry that their guy lost the election, right? Suppose, fair and square, we have these checks and balances in place, but yet they went against that. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the checks and balances and how they've saved us?
Well, look, I never thought the prospect of Trump becoming a tyrant or a coup succeeding was credible. If you think about what would be required to mount a coup in the USA, I mean, it would require such massive covert organization across so many institutions. This is one of the great things about, about countries like America and Australia. It's not just that they are democracies, albeit we might say, that in some places isn't working quite as well now as it could. But one equally important with what happens in the political sphere is that they're pluralistic societies, that power is widely, you can say not widely enough or whatever, but it's fairly widely, power and influence are fairly widely distributed in these societies. And this is immensely important. I'll come back to that in a minute, if I may. But just on your question, in direct response to your question, look, I don't know about the security arrangements in Washington. I won't make a comment about that because I just don't know enough about why they were so bad. But if I ask myself the question of what would you need to do to actually mount something like a coup in America, you'd have to somehow get the judiciary on side. You'd have to get alternative executive governments in place, not just in DC, but across all the states. You'd have to have the military on side. One of the things that classically happens during a coup is the channels of communication are under control as well. The classic, and during the sad period of African history, when there were many coups in the mid 20th century, you'd get the TV station, you'd get the House of Parliament, the executives' officers, and the military, and you were pretty much done. How do you do that in America? It's extremely difficult. I find it extremely difficult to imagine the level of covert organization that would be required. And the idea that all these institutions would abandon a deeply held conviction that it is the Constitution that has helped to make America what it is, for any leader, let alone anyone, as unusual as Trump. I mean, to go back to the question of a pluralistic society, this is very important. It's very important in the economic sphere as well. But it's related to the coup question because it means, how widely would you have to, how many institutions would you have to subvert to be able to pull off a coup? The answer is a very large number. But it turns out pluralism, not just in the political sphere, but in the economic and cultural spheres, are very important to the resilience of societies like these. They can be clumsy in the short term. Their conflicts and their flaws are on display for everyone to see. But in the long term, the fact that you don't have all political and economic power concentrated in a few hands actually makes them more adaptable than the usual form of human government, which is more, a top-down autocratic, aristocratic sort of system of government, which also seeks to appropriate all the economic resources to its own benefit.
Mm-hmm. What would you like people to take away from your book and your important research and connection back to Great Britain? What would you like people to take away from your book? And where does it fit into our national dialogue right now, considering the atmosphere in America? Where does this piece of history fit into that and actually makes a difference? What do people walk away with your book?
Well, it's very surprising to me, because I came to this book, I wanted to write a history book, right? And I wanted it to be about a really important topic. Mm-hmm. Because I actually think that, notwithstanding all the information and material out there, relatively concise and digestible stories about some of the most important history in the world are not as common as you might expect. But I was really surprised to find that, as far as I know, no one had taken quite the approach that I've taken to this very important topic, because that's a bit surprising, because a lot of books have been written about it. And of course, scholars would say, or at least some scholars would say, yes, they know about the influence of the English Revolutionary period on the American Revolutionary period and the American Constitution. But that's not the way the story is told. So the motivation for writing it was this. So obviously, I hope this is what people would take away. They would take away that in a book that's only 150 pages and that's written in a fairly clear and concise way, I can say that because other people have said it. I'm not just making that up myself. This tells me the deep story of how the Constitution came about. It doesn't seek to tell people what they should think about the Constitution. It doesn't tell people about how the Constitution operates today. What it tries to do is to give them, a tool in their toolkit where they can better understand today by understanding where the Constitution came from. I mean, I think that one of the problems with the mythologizing of the Constitution that used to go on a lot in America, and now by some people, the demonizing of the Constitution, is both of them have their expectations too high. I mean, this is a remarkable piece of work, the Constitution, that was developed at a particular moment in time by people in a particular situation. It contained great innovations. It's had enormous influence on America, but on world history since. But it is something of its time. I don't mean that I'm not implying that it's superseded. I'm just saying, when you try to understand it, don't just bring a perspective from where we are now. Think about where it came from.
Okay. I wanted to ask you this, as a lawyer, and I'm sure you've heard of critical race theory. Where does critical race theory as a legal course fit into your perspective in Two Revolutions and the Constitution?
Well, critical race theory is not relevant to my book or directly to the Constitution. I mean, if you take the idea that the way you should define political society is by looking at an oppressor group, an oppressed group, and that you should take remedial action to empower the oppressed group and disempower the oppressor group. That's obviously not something that was on people's minds when the Constitution was drafted, and it's not directly relevant to the Constitution as a document or a system now. Let me explain what I mean by that. I mean, the Constitution is overwhelmingly a mechanistic document, right? It establishes the mechanics within which government can operate, okay? It doesn't dictate policy. So the question becomes, if you're an advocate, if you accept that as a sensible way to analyze political society and you're an advocate for the oppressed group, then the question becomes something like, well, how can this oppressed group gain or exercise power through the mechanics established by the Constitution? And that obviously comes down to questions, if you're just looking at it in the framework of the Constitution, to the functioning of the electoral and representative process and the House and presidential elections, and perhaps to a lesser degree on, well, no, not to a lesser degree, and also on the development of jurisprudence that might assist this in the Supreme Court. But the Constitution doesn't provide the content for any of that. It provides the framework for it. And that's no doubt why one of the reasons that critical race theorists are not only active in the political sphere, but they're very active in the cultural sphere, because they're trying to influence the behaviours of enough and the beliefs of enough of the electorate for those mechanisms to then operate in a way that's favourable to their theory. But this is one of sorry, you go.
I was going to say, would you think critical race theory would essentially demonize the Constitution?
Well, it can do, because people have an exaggerated idea about what the Constitution is. I mean, if you look at the question of slavery in the Constitution, right? Some people think the Constitution is impugned because it didn't outlaw slavery. Well, actually, there is one anti-slavery measure in the Constitution. Slavery is only effectively mentioned or dealt with in 3 places in the Constitution. One of them is sort of an anti-slavery measure. It's the contemplation that from 1808, the Atlantic slave trade might be abolished. The other 2 are not anti-slavery measures. They're effectively living with slavery measures. But you've got to understand that at the time, it was a choice between union of the 13 colonies and accepting the continuance of slavery, or no union of the 13 colonies, right? There was already strong anti-slavery sentiment in the Northeast. It was already effectively unconstitutional in Massachusetts. And in years afterwards, a number of the Northeastern states were introducing anti-slavery measures. What I found particularly interesting is in the middle colonies, including Virginia, which is thought of then as being perhaps more a middle colony, the attitude to slavery was actually ambivalent. The Virginian economy was pretty dependent upon slavery, and yet there were Virginians, including those in the room at Philadelphia, who didn't speak in favor of its abolition, but were obviously saw the moral issues with slavery. And don't forget the Constitution itself, not so much the Bill of Rights, but the Constitution, as I say, is mainly a mechanistic document. It's not mainly a document that makes moral or political assertions about the content of policy. What it does is establish a system, the mechanisms for government.
And yet, all men are created equal has been the foundation to pivot and change.
Yes, that's right.
Our society. So
that's
may have been the mechanics of it, but it is a living, breathing document. I mean, at one point,
yes, of course. Well, it's living and breathing because of the way the mechanics are used. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Declaration and that statement in the Declaration, the author of which was principally, at least, Thomas Jefferson, mm-hmm. Who, as you know, is a slave owner and had intimate relations with slaves and so on.
Absolutely.
It shows, what it shows is you can say that shows that they were, hypocrites or moral imbeciles or whatever.
Tyrants themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. You could say that, and in a sense, that's true. You can also say that they're living on this issue in a complicated world, because their political instincts and philosophy and their moral philosophy are telling them one thing, but their economic interest is telling them another thing, and they're very deeply conflicted about this. And you can see that conflict right on the face of the debates. You can see it right there in the Declaration of Independence. So should they not be conflicted? Well, they couldn't not be conflicted. Should they have resolved the conflicts in the way that we would say was right? Well, of course we would say that. But, one of the things we have to do, there's a bit of a tendency with some people when they're looking at history now to regard it as some sort of dystopian version of the present, right? That, well, I wouldn't have done that. Well, actually, you would have if you'd been then, because you were living in a different world. You're not actually, in some sense, you're made from the same stuff as they are made from. I think that if you look at it, if you think of the Constitution as more as a mechanistic document, and if you think of the Bill of Rights as providing the moral political principles, then actually, and as you know, I make this point in the book, actually what it did was establish a framework where over time these things could change. And that's immensely significant. Is it unfortunate that at the time the South had resorted to an institution imported from the Caribbean and Barbados, had a particularly brutal form of slavery? Well, yes, of course, it's a tragedy, but that's the world in which these people were living.
Yeah. Can the American Constitution still act as the savior of the world and the blueprint, the template of how other societies should govern themselves? Can we still point to the Constitution as the most important document to govern people?
Well, yes, as the example and the first great written constitution. So it's the second modern written constitution. The first was implemented by some revolutionaries in Corsica just a few years before, but that was not of much historical significance. So yes, the written constitutions as a foundation of more democratic and pluralistic societies has obviously had an enormous influence. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write about the topic. It is relevant not just to America, but to the world. And that will continue to be the case. In terms of the content of the Constitution, well, people have had a chance to observe the operation of the American Constitution, and I would say that in some more recent constitutions, some of the issues of the American Constitution have been addressed. So I think more as the example and the foundation, perhaps, than in all its contents, the American Constitution will continue to have massive global significance.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a very informative conversation. I really enjoyed it. And, especially coming from an Australian. And, I actually read that the folks in Australia are more interested in politics in America than they actually are in the politics in their neck of the woods. I think
that's one of the reasons is because of that friction, right? Which doesn't necessarily always make for great outcomes, but it certainly makes for drama. So yes, there's a lot of interest down here. But one of the things that I hope I brought to this project was not just that it's being outside, but it's also not having a strong ideological conviction or wanting to write a polemical book, right? I really did. I mean, of course, I'm sure I have my own biases and whatever, but I really did want to just try to tell the story in a neutral way about the deep context of the Constitution and not to push any particular barrow. And I think that being from outside probably helped in that way because, the over-mythologizing that used to go on about the American Constitution has perhaps led in some cases to excessive pushback and excessive denigration of it. And I'm not really emotionally invested in or ideologically invested in either of those positions.
I see. Well, it's certainly been a great conversation, and I agree with you that the Constitution is still our guiding principles, and it's still a very important document. And it's such a great reminder that this is a living, breathing document that still governs and shapes us and shapes our humanity. And so it is a nice reminder that there's still so much more that needs to be learned about it, and not just its origin, but its meaning, its spirit, and its power that impacts not just us here in America, but like you said, everyone else in the world. So thank you so much, James Phillip. James Phillip is the author of Two Revolutions and the Constitution. He's a Sydney-based attorney, and you can find his book on Amazon. Am I right?
You're right, absolutely. And that's Phillips. It's Phillips with an S, by the way, Philips.
Sorry, Phillips. James D.
That's all right.
And I will have a link in this story. Thank you again. I'm Judette
Thank you
Lenoir.
so much, Jeanette. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm Judette Lenoir with ePluribusAmerica, and this is Our American Culture.